Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 262. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about ruins, Iraqi, and the Archduke Ferdinand as we go to Bosnia.
Got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Before we get into this week's interview, I have two rather baffling stories for you. The first one comes from the Tampa airport, which shut down January 13th because workers repainted numeric designators and replaced signs on the runways to reflect the shift in the Earth's magnetic North Pole. I don't know why it affected Tampa more than anybody else, but that was the story I heard. And then the second one is a good news, bad news story. First, the bad news, there was a person who was a ethnic Turk who tried to hijack a plane to Turkey, claiming to have a bomb. The good news is that he was overpowered by passengers on the plane. The rather puzzling news is he was trying to hijack the plane to Norway. He was on a plane from Norway. I might suggest that next time he doesn't get on the plane. For links to both of those stories, check out the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. I'd like to welcome to the show Stephanie Yoder, who's come to talk to us about Bosnia. Stephanie, welcome to the show.
Hello.
Stephanie and I met at the TBEX conference, the Travel Blog Exchange conference, last summer. And if you have met Stephanie, then you have also been struck with what a fun person she is. And so I looked and reached out to get Stephanie on the show. She is a travel blogger, and her site is 20-somethingtravel.com. Now, Stephanie, Bosnia, that is not a typical travel destination. And I think for many of us who are of a certain age, you say Bosnia, we still think war. So what am I missing by not having been to Bosnia?
I get a lot of funny looks when people ask me what my favorite country is, and I say Bosnia, because I think a lot of people do associate it with war and genocide. But it was interesting to actually go there because it's actually a really beautiful country. It has beautiful landscape, beautiful old Ottoman cities, and while you can still see that there's a lot of damage from the wars, it's a very peaceful place now, very safe, and the people are just so happy to have visitors coming back there.
And what was your itinerary in Bosnia?
I only spent about a week there, actually. I flew into Sarajevo and spent a few days there, and then what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to take a train down to Mostar, and it's really beautiful, but it also breaks a lot, so I took a bus to Mostar, and from there explored Herzegovina, the southern region of Bosnia, for about half a week.
Okay. And is that the itinerary you would recommend for others, or are there changes that you would make to that based on what you learned?
Well, I would really have liked to spend more time in Bosnia and maybe explore a little bit more of the northern region outside of Sarajevo, but generally Sarajevo and Mostar are the two major cities in Bosnia that you would probably want to base yourself out of.
And what surprised you about Bosnia?
Well, the first thing that surprised me, and maybe this makes me a little bit naive, but I was fairly young when the wars happened there. I think it was 1991 to 95, so I would have been about 10 years old.
And I think the fact that you have a site called 20-something Travel is a little bit of a giveaway that way, so...
Yes. So I wasn't as familiar with the history before I went. I read up on it, but it was very jarring to actually be in Sarajevo and see the bullet marks in the sidewalks. There's still a lot of bombed-out buildings there that I think they just can't really afford to knock down and rebuild. So they look like they have black eyes because all of the windows are broken. And that was very jarring to me. Also, in Sarajevo, there's just fields and fields of tombstones. It's a very hilly city, and there's hills that are just a sea of white tombstones of people who died during the siege of Sarajevo. So that was very jarring to see. On the other hand, I was also just surprised by how friendly the people were there and how excited they were to have travelers from America and from the outside world. They really don't want to be known just as a war-torn country.
Those of us who just had a big round birthday that is a little bit older than 26, we first heard about Sarajevo not for the war, but for the Winter Olympics. And of course, at that point, we saw this beautiful snow-covered, hilly city. And then later on, it came into our consciousness with the war there as Yugoslavia broke apart. But it really is interesting to have both pictures in my head of both this beautiful city and then also this tragedy that happened in Bosnia.
Yeah, I think they actually turned the Olympic Stadium into a graveyard. They didn't have anywhere else to put all the bodies.
Interesting. Now, that being said, you still said that Bosnia is the most beautiful country you've been to.
Oh, yes. The landscape is just gorgeous, especially as you were saying in Sarajevo. It's very hilly, and there's these white peaks in the background, and then these beautiful green mountains with these orange-topped houses going up of them. And once you get out of Sarajevo, it's just beautiful hills all through the countryside. When you get further down south, it's a little more arid, but it's just gorgeous hills everywhere. Waterfalls, things like that.
And you called it an Ottoman city. I'm not sure that everybody associates this part of the Balkans with the Ottoman Turks. But of course, they went all the way as far up as Vienna at one point and clearly left their mark on this area, especially religiously, obviously, and that was part of the war that was going on. But you say also in the architecture.
Yes, in Sarajevo, there's an Ottoman old quarter with a lot of markets in it. And I've not actually been to Turkey, so this is pretty much the closest I've been so far. It was very interesting to see. They have a lot of Turkish-style cuisine, and they drink the coffee there. They call it Bosnian coffee, but it's very similar to Turkish coffee.
Similar to Turkish coffee, you mean that it's actually served in small cups and it's a solid?
Yes, exactly. It's kind of like a jelly.
Okay.
It wasn't really my particular cup of tea or cup of coffee, but it was interesting.
Now, in Turkey, they also do serve cups of tea. And that's quite common in the cafes. So you still have a lot of that culture also.
Yes, well, especially because being an Islamic country, most people don't drink alcohol. So
Right.
You go to these little cafes and you can drink tea or coffee. Although they do make a very strong liquor as well called rakia.
Oh, is that made there? Okay.
Every hostel I've stayed in, on check-in, they make you take a shot of rakia.
Okay.
It's the polite thing to do.
And what would you recommend we see in Bosnia?
Well, you have to go to Sarajevo, of course.
But then in Sarajevo, what should we see?
You will want to go to the old Ottoman quarter and walk around. You can also go to the Spanish Bridge, which is a very historic bridge. It's where the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was shot, so basically where World War I began.
Okay.
So kind of a whole different era of history there. And then you can go on a tour of the Sarajevo Tunnel, which was really interesting. It's out past the airport, and basically when Sarajevo was under siege for 3 years and no one could get in or out, they dug this tunnel underneath the airport to the other side, and it was their only lifeline to the outside world. It's how they got all of their food and fresh water, things like that. It was very interesting to see, and it was very inspiring. I mean, they pretty much had to hand dig this tunnel. It's about a mile long.
Interesting. And it's now some sort of museum or memorial, or?
Yeah, it's a museum, and it's in the old house that it originally was in, and the thing is completely covered in bullet holes. It looks like it's about to fall down any moment.
Huh.
And you can go into the museum, and then you go down, and you can walk through about 100 meters of tunnels, and it's very cramped and small. It's hard to imagine walking a mile in that. But then they show videos of people trailing livestock through there and things like that.
And what else should we see in Sarajevo?
The main thing I did in Sarajevo was just walk around the different neighborhoods and walk up all the hills and observe all the views. Very, very beautiful. Then, stop in a cafe and have a beer and walk around some more.
Favorite vista point, favorite neighborhood?
Not that I know the name. Pretty much, if you pick any hill and walk up it. I mean, you want to stay on the main roads because some of the hills still have landmines in them.
Well, that's good to know.
Yeah. As long as you're on pavement, you're safe.
Okay. And you say, not that you would know the name of, was it difficult to get around with the language? I'm assuming you don't speak Bosnian-Herzegovinian.
No, I don't at all.
Or Serbo-Croatian, I think is the other name of that, or?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because they all call it their own language, the Bosnians, the Croatians, the Serbians, but it's very, very similar between all three. Because I went to Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia afterwards, and I picked up the words for beer and bakery, and I was pretty good to go.
And what are the words for beer and bakery?
Beer is pivo, and bakery is pekara.
Okay.
Those are the two words I usually try to learn as soon as I get to a country.
Okay. If you can get to the bakery and you can have a beer, then you can survive, is really what you're saying.
Pretty much.
Okay. I would have thought restroom would have been up there on the list to learn, but...
Oh, yeah. Well, you can mime that pretty well.
Okay. And then where else would you recommend?
Down south, go down to Mostar, which is beautiful. It has this enormous Ottoman bridge from the 1500s, and it was actually blown up during the war, but they've rebuilt it, and it's very, very beautiful. I think it's actually on the cover of the Lonely Planet book for Bosnia. And from there, you can go to several different areas of interest around Herzegovina. My favorite place that I went to was this Turkish monastery. It's like about an hour out of Mostar, and I hope I'm pronouncing it right. It's called Blagaj, and it's this beautiful Dervish monastery from, I think, the 14th century. It's set in the base of this enormous cliff, and at the bottom of the cliff, there's this beautiful river running out. And you can go and drink out of the river. It's supposed to be very holy. It's probably the best water I've ever tasted in my entire life. And you can have dinner at the base of the river, and it's just so very scenic and beautiful.
This is the dervishes who are known, the whirling dervishes, for their dancing. In particular,
Right.
Is that something that you experience at the monastery? Is that...
No, it's not in use anymore, but you
Okay.
can go on a tour of it and see the rooms where they, I guess, practice their whirling.
Okay. Interesting. If I want to experience Bosnia, we talked about where I should go and where I should see, and we talked about sitting in a cafe and having coffee or tea or walking the neighborhoods. Is there anything else that really helped you in, just a week experience the country?
Actually, just staying in the hostels was very interesting. The hostel we stayed in Mostar was a family-run hostel. And when I say family-run, I mean the owner's grandmother was in the kitchen making tea for everybody. One of the people I was traveling with got a head cold, and she spent an entire day nursing him and making him Bosnian chicken soup. The brother drove us out. He's actually the one who drove us out to the monastery. So it was almost just like staying with a family, except you pay them.
And what was the name of the hostel?
It was called Majda's, Majda.
Okay.
Definitely recommend anyone visiting Mostar to stay there. Very, very nice people.
Okay. Anything else that you would recommend? How about eating?
Eating. Well, they really love meat in Bosnia. I think it would be hard to make a go of it as a vegetarian. I think it's probably pretty similar to Turkish cuisine. They eat these big, beefy pastries. They're called burek, and they kind of have a light crust on them, and they're just filled with hamburger or ham, different meats. They also eat this dish called sevapi, which is kind of like kebab meat in a pita. And then the big thing to do there is you can get a mixed meat platter, which is about 5 different kinds of meat on a plate.
Now, I'm surprised they would have ham as an ingredient.
Yeah, not as much, actually. Not too much ham,
Okay.
but on occasion, yes.
Okay. And you got around mostly by walking with public transportation?
Yes, a lot of buses within the country. They have a train system, but it's very unreliable and breaks down a lot. So buses are the easiest way to get from city to city. Within the cities, none of them are terribly big. You can pretty much walk around.
And what's the best day you had in Bosnia?
The best day was actually probably the one that the brother of the hostel owner took us out in his van, and he took us to about 4 different major sites around Herzegovina. So we visited this beautiful old artist colony, and then we went to these Roman ruins from the 1st century BC. And then we went to this old waterfall. It's not an old waterfall, it's just a waterfall. It's out in the country. They call it the Bosnian Niagara Falls, and it's not quite as impressive as Niagara Falls, but it was completely empty, no one else there, and we could swim around, and you can swim behind the falls and things. Then we went to the Turkish monastery and had dinner there. So it was a very full day, very beautiful. There's just so much to see down there.
And I'm not sure that everyone pictures Roman ruins in this area, but this would be, I think, ancient Thrace, if I've got the right place.
I think so, yeah. Yeah, there's old Roman ruins, and there's all these castles from, like, 5th century BC, and I kept thinking the whole time I was there, you can go in and you can climb all over them. I said, if these were in Western Europe somewhere, they'd be totally roped off, and you'd have to pay 15 euros and go on a tour, but here you can just climb all over them.
Interesting.
Whether it's safe or not.
And one of the questions I ask, especially when we go someplace that's a little more off the beaten path, and I think this still counts as that, is when did you feel closest to home and when did you feel furthest from home?
Well, you know, it's funny. I was raised Catholic, and one of the biggest Catholic pilgrimage sites in Europe is actually in Bosnia. It's called, let me see if I can pronounce this correctly, Medjugorje. And it's a site where some teenagers saw a vision of the Virgin Mary on a hillside, and now there's a giant church there, and you can go there, and there were just huge busloads of Irish tourists, and they sell all sorts of various rosaries and statues of Jesus and things. But it was such an odd thing to see in, you know, a Muslim country, a country that was very different from anywhere I'd been, and then there's giant cats.
And by the way, I was wrong. It wasn't ancient Thrace. It was ancient Dalmatia, as in where the Dalmatians come from.
Oh, that makes sense because the Croatian coast is the Dalmatian
coast. Yes, I should have figured that out.
Yes. I actually should have remembered that because I used to have a Dalmatian, and I remember being amused at that when I was there. When I felt furthest from home. You know, I think it really was in downtown Mostar. They were actually hit even, I don't know if harder by the war than Sarajevo, but they haven't done as much rebuilding. And when you walk around, it's like really being in some sort of apocalyptic post-war wasteland with these bombed-out skyscrapers and bullet holes everywhere. It's just so bizarre, and I'd never seen anything even remotely like it. It was very jarring.
And then did you use a guidebook to get around?
I had a Lonely Planet Western Balkans book that helped me with most of it, but a lot of it was advice from the hostel owners and other people who happened to be around.
And any advice, places that people recommended you go or the guidebooks recommended that you would steer people away from, or vice versa, places that you discovered through the locals that you hadn't read anything about?
Well, one place we did end up going that I don't think was in the guidebook, it was a day trip from Sarajevo. It was this town called Travnik.
Okay.
And it has this really huge old Roman fortress. I don't even know what year it's from. It's quite old. It's maybe like 1000 AD or something. Just this enormous fortress that you can go up and climb around. And then at the base of it, there's this beautiful man-made river where they keep trout. And it was a very hot day there, and it was very refreshing to just sit by the river and drink a beer. So that's definitely a place worth checking out. You can get there on the bus. I think it's about an hour and a half from Sarajevo.
Okay.
Once we got out there, we had a really hard time getting back, actually, because nobody spoke English and none of the signs were in English. But we eventually managed to get ourselves on the right bus home. It's also the place I first saw my first squat toilet.
Well, that's something you have to remember. What do you wish you had known before you went to Bosnia?
I definitely wish I had educated myself a little bit more about the history and the politics of Bosnia, because it's clearly such a big part of what Bosnia is today, the things that happened during the war. And I had a pretty good overview. I did the Wikipedia thing, but I think it was a lot more complicated and there's a lot more depth to it than I could really grasp at the time.
Well, the Balkans have been a complicated place for quite some time politically, so yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Well, it's interesting. I have a couple blog posts about my time in Bosnia and in Serbia. I get the most angry comments on those posts than anything else from locals who take issue with the things I've said, but they're often conflicting.
Interesting.
Like, someone will be, oh, well, Bosnia should be part of Serbia, and then someone will say, oh, well,
okay.
Serbian, you know. It definitely, there's a lot of emotion still around those conflicts.
One thing you saw that made you laugh and say, only in Bosnia.
Well, you know, it's funny. I rolled into the hostel in Mostar, and I had a bit of a cold. I just wanted to go and crash and go to sleep, and the hostel owner kept insisting that I needed to take a shot with her of the rakia. And I really didn't want to, and she kept insisting. She said, no, it'll be good for your cold. It'll clear you up. You know what? It actually did. I felt much better afterwards.
Now, I don't know if it's similar to the rakia that I had in, I want to say, Greece, but it would certainly clear out your sinuses.
Yes.
I can't say that I ever developed a taste for it, but...
Well, they all seem to make it themselves, and it's just incredibly strong. It's like drinking gasoline or something. Not sure I could sip it.
Yeah, a little bit like moonshine was my impression, but...
Yeah. Seems to be popular over a lot of Eastern Europe.
Before we go to wind this down, anything else that people should know before they go to Bosnia?
Well, I would just encourage people to really consider going to Bosnia. I've written about it quite a bit on my blog and kind of made it my personal mission to get people to be interested in visiting the Balkans, because I think it's such a neat area and an area that really people don't even think about. It gets very overlooked, but it's definitely up and coming, and it's interesting, and it's different, and it's really worth a look from people.
Excellent. Last two questions. Finish this sentence. You really know you're in Bosnia when what?
You really know you're in Bosnia when you're sitting by the river eating an enormous plate of meat, looking at a bridge that's 500 years old.
Okay. And if you had to describe Bosnia in 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
I'm going to go with green,
Okay.
jarring,
Interesting.
and optimistic.
Okay. Well, that's a good note to end it on. Again, Stephanie's blog is 20-somethingtravel.com. And our guest again has been Stephanie Yoder. Thanks so much for coming on the show and telling us about your love for Bosnia.
Thank you for having me.
I just got an email from Monk, and I mean just as in while I was recording this, that has me a little confused. Monk says, I've listened to countless amateur traveler podcasts. I'm a big fan of your show, and you do a great job hosting it. I just returned from Asia and found that your interviews really helped me to get a sense of what to expect there. The only show I didn't care for was the one on LA. I've traveled to many cities all over the world, and LA is still my favorite. I'm not sure you did justice in the assessment, as most folks don't. And I'm puzzled because so far as I know, we've never done a show on Los Angeles. but we are going to rectify that. Actually, there's a two-part episode on Los Angeles that's coming up, probably airing on January 29th as the first time that will be out. That is recorded with Eric Schwartzman, who's a friend of mine who's from LA, grew up there. So I'm hoping that will solve the problem that you were reporting. And I'm wondering what episode you may have heard of, or if I'm just losing my mind. We had a fair amount of feedback on the Melbourne show. Larry wrote and said, I've been doing my trip planning for Melbourne, and Andy confirmed about 99.9% of what I've read from various sources. What really sold me to visit was the first world public transit system. May not be perfect, but with an extensive tram and rail network, capped fares, it should be easier to get around than any major Australian city and easier not to get lost. Thanks for the tip on Phillip Island. I also heard from Tom, who said, if you make it to Melbourne, go 90 minutes northwest to Ballarat. They have a wild animal park there. You can pet and feed kangaroos and koalas. We petted a wombat that they pushed around in a wheelbarrow. It was that large. You get to see Tasmanian devils and spend the day in an old gold mining city. Worth the drive. And this is where the controversy started to come in, because our guest Andy Dye said that he didn't particularly enjoy seeing the fairy penguins at Phillip Island. And Tom wrote and said, fairy penguins I thought were worth the trip. Living in Michigan, we don't get to see them here. It smells really bad, and they do make a lot of noise, but how many times do you get to see penguins in their natural habitat? I should add, we are huge animal people. Cute city to stroll the streets, if nothing else. And then also, when I do an episode, I have a tendency to try and write everyone I can find who was mentioned in the show. That is, all the hotels, the visitors' bureaus, the zoos, and all of the museums that we talk about. I try and send an email just to let them know that we've talked about them on the show. Well, I heard back from Sue, and Sue wrote, as someone who works for the Penguin Parade, the not-for-profit Phillip Island Nature Park. And I would have to say that Sue was a little disappointed in Andy's assessment of the park, and I encouraged Sue to put in her entire comment as a comment on the episode, so I'm not going to try and read all of it. She does have a couple little things here. First of all, Andy referred to the penguins as fairy penguins. They're actually little penguins, and they don't live on the beach. They actually burrow on land, and there's a lot of work being done to protect and rehabilitate their habitat. And the one thing Sue was surprised about was regarding photographs, because apparently Andy said something about lots of blinding loads of flashes. And Sue wrote and said that they usually, or her experience, enforce a no photo policy, and 99% of the people abide by that, respecting the little penguins. And then a ranger is supposed to, and in her experience does, if they see someone taking out a camera, politely ask them to put it away. So she has not seen, as Andy reported, a blinding load of flashes. Andy also called the parade a circus, and she was disappointed to hear that a lot of work has been put in place to ensure the safety, protection, and comfort of the penguins as they come over the beach. 80 years ago, people would just sit on the beach almost touching the penguins, not the most comfortable environment for the little penguins. But since then, and working with the rangers and researchers, the parade now comprises raised boardwalks with specific seating areas so the penguins can come and go from the ocean unhindered to their burrows. I always like it when we have a little controversy on the show. It's not surprising, too, because obviously whenever we have anybody on, they offer a specific point of view, and they offer their own point of view. And that's what I ask them to do. But as you can see, Tom and Sue don't agree with what Andy said, and they have a different point of view. So you may want to go and check it out yourself when you're in Melbourne, and let us know what you think. With that, we're going to end this episode of The Amateur Traveler. If you have any opinions of your own that you'd like to express, you can add them as a comment on this episode at theamateurtraveler.com, or send me an email to host@amateurtraveler.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at Chris2X. And as always, thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit